Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Iowa Downtown Resource Center's website through the Iowa Economic Authority. Because it's being recorded, we're asking you to please turn off your camera, mute your mic, and to unmute a little bit later, but we'll start with those mics muted. There'll be time for questions at the end, but you can, as you know, pose your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and we can address those at the end as well. So as you know, my name is Carol Lilly. I am a downtown development specialist with Main Street, Iowa. And as a previous director, I know firsthand whether you are a one-person show or you have a small team in place, personnel and basic financial record-keeping management can be a bit overwhelming for both new and experienced directors. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by Crystal Ford and Michelle Hekel from Bergan KDV for our session entitled HR and Financial Record Bootcamp. So Crystal is the company's market leader, and she has a master's degree in project management and a bachelor's degree in business administration. Michelle is an assurance manager and has a CPA and is both a master's and bachelor's degree in accounting from the University of Northern Iowa. So I'm going to turn things over to Crystal and Michelle at this point. They're going to tell you a little bit more about their background and then dig into today's topic. Thank you for joining us. And Crystal, it's over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, awesome. That's the first test of today. No, I'm just kidding. Well, thank you so much for having us. We're just absolutely thrilled to be here today. So we'll give you kind of the simple lowdown, kind of the boot camp of different things that you should know for HR and different things that you should know for financials. So kind of a little bit about who we are. I'm Crystal Ford. I'm the market leader with Bergan KDV here in the Cedar Valley. Before getting into operations, I always worked in human resources. I love people. I have a passion for people, and I'm just kind of an HR geek, and that's okay too. I'm also the current president for Community Main Street in Cedar Falls, and I also serve on the Org and Development Committee for Main Street and Waterloo. So I sincerely appreciate all that all of you do for our Main Street organizations. I know that all of you work tirelessly and do so much for our community. So as a current president, I thank you for everything that you have done. I also am on the board for the Iowa Women's Foundation, which is a great organization supporting women of Iowa. And I also am an active participant with SHRM, which is the Society for Human Resource Managers. So I'll let my tag team partner introduce herself, which is Michelle Hekel. Michelle, I'll let you take the mic.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Hekel. I've worked for Bergan for going on 10 years now. I'm an assurance manager and I focus mostly on nonprofit audits, and then I also do some 401k audits. I also serve on the board of the Family and Children's Council of Black Hawk County, and just have really enjoyed my time with them as well.
We're big volunteers here at Bergan KDV. We like to be overly involved. So first part of boot camp, HR. So the most important thing to me in place to start would be the employee handbook. It's the most critical document that your organization can have. I kind of think about it as the rules book. If it's not in the handbook, it doesn't exist. If it is in the handbook, it's the law of your land. You should see my handbook of Bergan KDV. I have a million different Post-it notes and tags all over our handbook so that I know exactly what policy is where, what rule is in place. It's important to know your handbook because if there's ever a situation where something is taken to a heightened level, say maybe it's to a court, to an unemployment hearing, your handbook is what's going to support you and ultimately support your organization. So it's important to know it, master it, know where everything can be located. You should make sure that you're also looking at your handbook on an annual basis and probably more than that too. So I put on here the important things about a handbook. Understand your policies. If you don't fully understand your policy, how can you make sure that it's being held to that standard. So fully understand all your policies. Understand where everything is located. There's been times where I've had to go down a disciplinary track with an employee, and it's important to know that the policy that was breached is on page 14, or whatever it may be when you have some sort of a disciplinary action situation. What policy in your handbook is actually in violation? That's also important when you're contesting unemployment, or something is being elevated, that you can also reference that and say the policy in breach is on page 14. So make sure you fully understand the policies. And if there is something that comes about when an employee is struggling with one, you can reference it and make sure that they fully understand it as well, so that if they are in breach of it later, they fully are aware that they're in breach of the policy. When do you update your handbook? Annually is great. If there's something that comes about throughout the year that needs a sudden update, that's okay too. You just need to make sure that all your employees are aware of the update. And it's also nice to keep your board in the loop too. I think about this year with COVID, there's been a lot of family first Coronavirus Act craziness that has come up with paid leave and leave for kids. And that's something that we quickly adopted into our handbook to make sure that we're supporting our employees in the event that they have to be gone. So update it annually. And if you need to, you can also do that throughout the year too. I would just urge that you don't make a very swift, crazy policy change mid-year. Sometimes those larger, let's change our PTO structure, let's change some of those bigger decisions are better if they're annual, and sync up with your fiscal year. Do you have a handbook acknowledgement document? When you have new employees that start with your organization, do you have them sign the employee handbook acknowledgement? Is that something that you have people do annually? Do you have a different way that people note that they have reread the handbook on an annual basis? If that's something you don't have in place, it's a great thing just to tack on to your planning. So if your fiscal year starts in July, maybe it's something you can have on your board's radar in May, just to make sure if there's any revisions or any changes and updates, that those can be fully vetted to go into place July 1. And then also, if you're an employee of one, make sure that you sign an acknowledgement that you have fully read the handbook that has been updated on an annual basis. Where is your handbook stored? Oh my gosh, great question, huh? You want to make sure that it's stored somewhere where your employees, your board, where everybody can have access to it. So whether that's a file electronically that everybody has access to, if it's something that's emailed out on an annual basis, or if updates occur, the most important thing is that people have awareness to where it's stored, where it's housed, so that they can always turn and be able to look up any information that they need to. That's also good too, so that say there's supposedly a policy in the handbook that you are in breach of as a director. You want to make sure that your board, anybody knows the policies that are in the handbook and that they're not manipulated or changed to behoove the leader of the organization. You just never want anything to look suspicious, or like it may be manipulated. So having it somewhere where everybody can see it also helps with that trust factor of making sure that these are the policies that are in place. So in short, know your handbook, live it, breathe it, know it. Pretend like you're in college and you're going to get quizzed on it, because you probably will. So next fun element, employee files. It is important to understand all the different laws and regulations when it comes to employee files. What can be in an employee file? What should be in an employee file? And it's even more important to know what cannot be in an employee file. Prior to COVID, we used to hear people all the time say, oh man, I have a surprise visitor from the government auditing my employee files. And I think sometimes growing up in the HR world, you're like, no one's going to ever come and check our employee files. Oh my gosh, there's actually government teams that do. So know that they're out there. Sometimes there's people that pop up and they want to look at your employee files. So it's important to make sure that you're doing the right things. So just some different things to go over. Understand what should be in an employee file. And I perform employee file audits. Have a standard checklist of what should be in an employee file. And again, if you're an employee of one, just a director, you still should make sure that you have a checklist of what goes in an employee file and that you yourself have those documents in your file. Whether you're a company of one or a company of 1,000, these rules still apply. So it's important to make sure that you know all of them. Where are employees' files saved? Where are they stored? Are they locked? If you're in an office with multiple employees or multiple tenants, it's important for security reasons that they are locked and not something that's easily accessible by visitors or unwanted visitors. Where are your I-9s stored? What about health documents? For all the things that can't be in an employee file, where is that other file? Just making sure that you have processes in place for that as well. Where are past employees' files stored? How long do you keep and retain employee files? The more you can have these questions asked and answered, the easier it'll make it for you. And again, just because you're an employee of one doesn't mean that you might not be asked for prior directors' files. Where are those stored? How long do we save those? Understand, create, and master all of those different policies so that if you're asked, you're able to answer. So understand the laws. Special point about the I-9s. There's no exceptions for completing an I-9. This must be done within 3 business days of their hire date. And they define hire date as the first day that an individual is paid for their services. So if they start on a Monday, they have to have their I-9 documents within that 3-day period. There's no special grace that can be given for that. And I, in prior lives, have had people be like, well, I don't know where my documents are. Well, then you probably can't start. It's the law, it's not a suggestion. So just making sure that you're very comfortable with those. On an I-9, if you have a document from column A, that's fine. You can have a single document, and that could be a passport. It could be a permanent resident card, could be an alien registration card. That column A gives you a choice of just one. If an employee does not have a column A, they can go to a column B and C, but they need 2 documents. So most commonly, you'll see a driver's license and a social security card. There's other examples of options B and C. Just make sure that you read those. And if, sorry for the little feedback there. And if somebody tries to give you a document that's not listed in column B and column C, that you do not accept it. I know sometimes I'll have clients that call and they're like, I'm getting this Sam's Club membership card as an ID. Is that something we can use in an I-9? No. So make sure that you understand what can and cannot be used when it comes to I-9s. See, now you can tell I'm an HR geek because I love stuff like I-9s. So employee file. These are some things that you can have in an employee file and something that I would audit for. It doesn't mean that you have to have all of these things. But if you do have these are great things that you can have in there. So an application, someone's resume, their offer letter, job description. If you do not have a job description for all the positions that are in your organization, that's something that I would work on. A job description can, again, protect you and your organization. Confidentiality agreements, non-competes, new hire checklists, handbook acknowledgement, remember that one, drug testing acknowledgement, background consent. These are not the actual results of those, but these are more so the acknowledgement that they're giving permission for them to be done. Anything when it comes to performance records. So evaluations, self-evaluations, disciplinary warnings, whether it's a written warning, a final warning, a discipline. Any awards or recognition, that's a lot happier than discipline, isn't it? So you can put those awards in their employee file too. You can also put trainings. It's a great place to house them to make sure that they're all there and secure. If there's any safety trainings, job specific trainings, anything that your company does, it can go in there. Any sort of separation record would be great to have in your employee file too. So if somebody does put in their resignation, you want to make sure that you have it in writing to support you and the organization. So that should go in there. Any notes referencing about the situation that occurred, why they're leaving, exit checklist, anything that has to do with an employee leaving the organization, those would all be great to have in that employee file too. So on the opposite side, what are things that you should not have in your employee file? Well, the first, never ever have any I-9s in the employee file. So one of the first things that those fun government auditors do is they're like, let me see your employee file, and they're looking for I-9s. Never ever have an I-9. The document, the photographs of any of the supplemental identification cards, none of those should go in there. One of the things that I always did as a best practice is as soon as somebody started, their completed I-9, any sort of documentation with that, always goes in a separate I-9 folder. I always had mine alphabetized by employee, and that way it makes it super easy if an employee resigns and leaves. I can go to that I-9 file, find them alphabetically, pull them, and re-put their I-9 with their employee file after they're no longer employed with the organization. But it's very important that they're not in the file together when they're an active employee. So along those same lines, any investigation notes. So say that you have an employee that you have to do an investigation for. Maybe it's sexual harassment, maybe it's fraud, maybe it's something icky and crazy. If there's any sort of an investigation that needs to take place for an employee, those notes should not be in their employee file. They should be housed separately. Once again, at the termination of their employment, you can put those back and then keep them forever in the employee file. But while they're a current employee, they need to be separate. Same thing with drug test results, background check results. I have a handy dandy separate folder that I keep those in too. Same thing with medical records. So if it's an application for insurance or dental insurance, any of those medical documents need to be housed in a separate file. Anything related to like credit checks. Some organizations have that as part of their hiring process. Those again should be kept in a separate file. So it sounds like a lot of separate files, huh? Keep them organized, keep them alphabetized, and once they do leave employment, you can pull those puppies, put them back in their normal employee file, and then save them in your terminated employees area. Fun stuff, right? Sometimes when you're not used to working with employee files, it's like, I had no idea. Well, now you do. Go make sure that your I-9s are not in there. So another piece, performance. I love talking about performance. And I think there's two different things to really think about when it comes to performance management. One would be ongoing. So the ongoing day-to-day of performance management. And the second piece would be like your annual performance evaluation. So in an ongoing, it's important to have a process, standards, and to know what to do if something occurs that requires disciplinary action. So this is really understanding, again, what's in your handbook. If somebody breaches a policy, what disciplinary actions do you have and do you take? So making sure that you understand that. So what is the current process? What are your disciplinary steps? Where are they in the handbook? Does everybody follow these? Do they know these? I was talking with a client, this was a while back, and they were like, well, we have an attendance policy, we just never uphold it. I'm like, oh, so what happens the second that somebody starts like, I'm sick again, and you have a violator they're going to come back and be like, you never made them have to uphold the attendance policy. Why me? That feels kind of targeted, feels kind of malicious, and it can go down a rabbit hole. So make sure you know the policies, and then ultimately you follow the policies. How do you document when a situation occurs? Where do you store those? How do you know that consistency is in place? So if you do eventually have a team of 2, 3, 4, making sure that all of the people are held to the same standards. Because the last thing you want is somebody saying, why do you treat me different than you treat all of them? And that can get you and your organization in a pickle if you're not upholding consistency. So very, very important. So on the other side of this would be your annual performance review. So how often, when are these conducted? Hopefully annually. Sometimes there's more than that. But are they in June? Are they in January? Sometimes it just aligns with whatever your fiscal calendar is. Have a plan ahead of time, if you don't already, for what is the process. Not to pick on Carol, but I know a couple years back with our Cedar Falls Community Main Street, we really spent a lot of time digging into this as the executive board. And we created a self-evaluation for our director to complete. We created evaluations for all of the executive board to create or to complete for the director. And we made a timeline of when each is due. When's the self-eval due? When is the executive board's evaluations due? When do we review that with the executive director? And we made a really strong outline so that it can be carried out year after year after year and have that consistency. I hope many moons from now, when I'm no longer president or on the board, that they still utilize that. There was a lot of work that went into it, but now it takes that guessing game away. I always feel so bad when people are like, well, I had a performance evaluation 4 years ago. Like, oh my gosh, how do you know how you're doing? So just pre-plan those steps. I like having a self-evaluation, and I like having an evaluation by somebody else. I think that opens a great dialogue to say, I see you rated yourself the highest you can get. Tell me about that. I gave you a 7 and this is why. Let's have this good dialogue. Those moments are really eye-opening. And I think sometimes it helps just to really be direct on, this is my expectation of a 10, and I know you can get there next year. Let's work on it together. So really crafting what it looks like. We spend a lot of time too talking about scoring. If you're on a 1 to 10 evaluation system, what's a 2? What's a 4? What's an 8? Just to make sure that you don't have that meanie that gives everybody 2s, and then somebody else that gives everybody 10s. So just making sure that you have some consistency on that. So to recap my section of the HR boot camp, I would focus on the 3 top things in my eyes first, and that would be your policies. Making sure that you know your handbook, you have a strong handbook, it's an updated handbook. A lot of people are starting to look at it with remote working being so common. Some people didn't have that in the handbook, that was even an option. So your policies, number 1, making sure that you have a very strong and confident set of policies. 2, employee files. Don't go to HR jail. I'm just kidding. I don't think there is one. There might be. But make sure that you know what goes in all those files. And the last one, performance management. Having some sort of structure for the day-to-day, and then also the annual reviews. If you start with those 3, you'll be in pretty good shape. And after you do those, you can look into other things like onboarding, training, engagement, hiring. Those things can come next, but focus on those 3 first. So that's the end of my HR boot camp. Going to hand it over to my tag team partner, Michelle, and she'll give you some financial boot camp. So Michelle, it's all yours.
Okay, so financial boot camp. The first topic we want to talk about is segregation of duties. We'll also talk about document retention and destruction policies. So with segregation of duties, it's a topic that comes up in any size organization. The AICPA has provided guidance on best practices for segregation of duties within 2, 3, and 4-person entities that we've laid out on the next few slides. The goal of the segregation of duties is not to have any one person be in charge of a complete transaction cycle. It's also important to segregate writing checks and depositing money, so the cash transaction cycles. So to get started, within a 2-person entity, the accountant or another staff could, mail checks, write checks, reconcile the bank statements, record debits and credits or journal entries, approve payroll, and approve purchase orders and check requests, while the executive director then would want to receive and open any bank statements, sign checks, make the deposits, so they're separating that cash disbursement and cash receipt transactions, perform bank transfers, review bank reconciliations, and approve vendor invoices, and perform an overall analytic on the financial statements. They'd also want to be in charge of the big picture items like signing contracts and making some of the compensation adjustments and that sort of thing. One thing that we've told most of our clients is that it's also important that someone review the bank reconciliation after it's performed, and that the person that is reviewing it receives an unopened copy of the bank statement or has online access to view. So if 2 people are getting a copy of the bank statement or viewing it online, it limits the chances of fraudulent activity. So moving on to a 3-person entity, you can further segregate duties between the disbursements and cash receipts processes. So while one person is in charge of writing checks and the bank reconciliation, another can approve payroll, mail the checks, and process vendor invoices. This frees up the executive director to be able to sign checks, perform high-level analytics, and review the bank reconciliation, as well as sign any important contracts for the organization. Moving on to a 4-person entity, you can segregate the processing of invoices, writing checks, and the payroll distribution among the 3 accountants or other staff that's involved. And with this level of segregation, a person that's not involved in the cash disbursement process can review the bank reconciliations, leaving the executive director to focus on big picture items as well as signing checks. Now that we've discussed the segregation of duties, a few key points to note are the executive director should receive an unopened copy of the bank statement or have online access, and banking transactions should be reviewed monthly to ensure there's no unusual transactions that need to be addressed immediately. A detailed review of payroll reports should be done prior to paying any employees to ensure accuracy. It's a lot easier to correct any misstatements before the payroll is paid rather than after it's left the bank account. Financial statements should be reviewed monthly with an emphasis on liquidity, budget to actual comparisons, and other key performance indicators that are important to your organization. It's also important to understand cash versus accrual, as you'll be making decisions based on your cash needs, while your financial statements may be on an accrual basis. One other item that's important to make sure is that the financial statements are reliable and up to date so that timely decisions can be made. If your financial statements are being done 2 months later after the fact, it's not as easy to make those important decisions timely. The next topic is document retention and destruction. It's important to have a policy surrounding this, and the policy should address whether your paper and electronic documents, when they will be destroyed, how long they'll be kept, and as Crystal mentioned earlier, if it isn't in the policy, it doesn't exist. So the National Council on Nonprofits, Crystal, if you want to flip the slide, has created a standard table for various documents and how long they should be kept. So the next couple of slides actually is their table on suggested best practices. So the first part of the table, you can see audit reports should be kept indefinitely, while bank reconciliations and deposit slips really only need to be kept for 2 years. Any legal correspondence or mortgage items, those would also want to be kept permanently. And the last half of the table, year-end financial statements, board minutes, retirement records, those are a few examples of items that should also be kept permanently, whereas payroll-related items like timesheets and other payroll information should be kept for about 7 years. If you can include this information in your policy, there will not be any questions on why something's no longer in your possession or kept, why you have no documentation on it.
So Michelle, just to kind of put you on the spot, when you work with different nonprofit organizations, what are some of the common errors that you see the most? So if you go to a nonprofit, what are some of the things that you most commonly have people be like, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to do that?
Going back to the segregation of duties, a lot of, the bank statements, that's been one that we've suggested to a number of our clients over the last couple of years, is having two people receive bank statements or have access, and really having them both looking at the transactions, because it's a lot harder for two people to collude than it is for one person to do anything fraudulent. I think that's probably the biggest thing. We have had some clients that are, behind in their financial statements and how fast they're getting them prepared monthly. And so the board's behind in reviewing them, and they really can't make those tough decisions, especially when it comes to a year like this year when there's COVID and some harder decisions have to be made sometimes.
Gotcha. Those are two great suggestions. And how about on the retention of documents? Where are some good places to save them? I know I think back to some different on-site places that I've been where they're like, oh, they're in this shed, like out behind our building. Where are some good places to save some of these documents that need to be retained?
I think it's up to the organization. We have some that they scan everything so they can have a file storage somewhere. They take it off site at night so that they never lose it. That seems to be the easiest way to go rather than having a lot of paper sitting around. But we do have some organizations that, they put it in a file box and in their storage locker or somewhere like that. And it's just, here's the date that this stuff needs to be discarded or shredded or whatever the case may be.
Gotcha. How about any worries or safety or concerns of permanently keeping documents? What about those that don't go through the shred cycle of getting rid of documents after the exhausted date? How do you feel about that?
I think it's a lot of information out there that you don't want somebody to accidentally get a hold of if you don't need it out there. So it really is a best practice to get rid of, and you don't want to keep extra paper or anything else lying around that you have to sift through later when you have to look for items. So I think it could be a liability to your organization to keep some of that stuff if you're not getting rid of it, and it doesn't have to be kept permanently. Just as well as a nuisance to sift through if you do have to find something.
Yeah. No, that's great. Sorry to put you on the spot. Just thinking about questions that I frequently hear people say. So that was kind of the end of our formal presentation, but we wanted to leave a good chunk of time for questions. These are two topics that people are always asking questions about, and that's okay. It's because there's a lot of things that continually change. So it's important that you're always staying updated. So Carol, I might send it back to you to see how you want to handle questions and comments.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. Now, if you would like to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand and go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question, or you can type it in the chat function too. We did not have any questions come in yet, so I think there's a lot of really one of the way we described it earlier today was meaty information. I think there's probably things that a lot of directors are kind of spinning their heads going, oh my gosh, I didn't think about that. I think the one thing that I would tap on and just remind people too is even as an employee of one, if you were the sole person in the office, you are still responsible to guide your board and board president that these things need to be done if you don't have someone quite as savvy as Cedar Falls was lucky to have a few years back to help get us kind of back on track. So we did have one question coming through the chat. So how do you provide separation of duties when you only have one part-time staff person?
That's a great question. And in that case, we suggest getting the board involved. A lot of times it's the treasurer that helps out. But it could be anybody on the board that's willing to help out and do that second person duty so that you have two people in charge.
Thank you. Good question.
And I think that's a great one too in our slide deck where it shows the separation of duties. That's a good one just to keep in reference so that you can make sure that you're checking all of those boxes. Same thing with auditing employee files. Those are great things just to reference and to always look back on too. But
Yeah,
yes, I think that's awesome, Michelle. Utilize your board. They're a great resource.
and I would note too that Susan did go ahead and upload the files, so you should have access through the invitation that she originally sent. So if any of you are wondering where to might see those, they are already up and available for you all to download. Any other questions?
Experts. The whole call's full of experts. That's great.
Well, I anticipate there might be some that come a little bit later as people start looking at their own files and wondering, am I doing this right or wrong? So that might pop up too. But we've got another question. In the event you hire someone that was a previous employee, do you pull their I-9s from their previous employee file, or is it best practices to start from scratch?
I would start from scratch. Just in case, say that whoever hired them previously was not militant about making sure that identifications were accurate, up to date, acceptable. I would treat it just like it's a new employee. And same thing with, you could ultimately at the end of that employment cycle put them together, but I would start a new file.
Right, thank you. Any other questions? We're going to do a 10, 9, 8 countdown here.
Well, I appreciate it on behalf of Bergan KDV. We love being able to be here. We love to be able to talk to all of you. And again, as a big supporter of Main Street organizations, you guys do so much for our communities. So I thank you for all of that too. It's a lot that all of you do.
And we have a question that just came in. So before we close, if a local Main Street program has a question about financial policies or HR practices, what local resources would you point them to?
Great question. I would say one could be your board, especially with what your board is comprised of. You could have people that have that financial knowledge or background, or somebody with that HR expertise. So sometimes utilize who all is on your board. When I think about our executive team, we have a president of a bank, so utilizing those. If your organization does have a financial review or an audit, you could also reach out to your auditors that you utilize. And there's also, most communities have local HR chapters, so you can always reach out to them as well too, just to see if they can help you with guidance or anything of that nature. But I would say first tap into your board, see what resources that you might have there.
Great. Another question. What is the reason for having medical records or other items you mentioned previously in a separate file?
I think the thought around it is that it could give too much information that shouldn't be necessarily given the opinion on the employee itself. So if an employee has some sort of medical condition that's very private, it shouldn't be something that people that have access to the employee file necessarily need to know. So I think a lot of it is about sensitivity. And making sure that there's a privacy component to it. Because just who has those separate medical records might not be the same people that have access to the employee file. So largely privacy based.
Thank you.
I do have to say one thing about interviewing. Through COVID, we've been doing more and more interviews virtually. And there's been some interviews virtually where cameras haven't worked, or like all the normal tech scafus, right? But it's been very interesting to interview a lot of candidates with never seen them. And really listening and understanding their messages. It's actually been really beneficial not to have some undue bias that could be there. But I thought it's been a really fun experiment just to see if you interview someone without ever seeing them, meeting them, that's good. I think it's been a really good test.
That's a very good point, Crystal. Thank you. Well, I'll take this time to thank you, both Crystal and Michelle. We appreciate very much. Another question, here we go, before I close out. Is there an online resource you would suggest to help further our knowledge on HR best practices?
So I'm a member of SHRM, Society for Human Resource Managers, and oh boy, howdy, is that the best resource in the world. I will always renew my membership because I feel that organization is so up to date that it's worth my yearly dues to have access to them. And that SHRM, SHRM, Society for Human Resource Managers, it's a website that you can live chat with HR experts. You can have documents. It's a whole plethora of resources. Not everybody wants to pay to have a membership to it, but gosh, it's so great just to have access to all of that. And there's been a couple of times where I've utilized the hotline and been like, oh, I've got a doozy. I need to talk through this. But that's a great resource to utilize. And there's some stuff on SHRM that you don't have to pay for, but a lot of the nitty gritty icky stuff you do have to pay to have access for. Or find your own Crystal Ford. And it's always good to have a friend that's in HR and a friend that's a plumber.
And Susan just posted a link to SHRM's website, so thank you, Susan, for that. That's in the chat. But yeah, I guess just one of the things to close, which I didn't plan on saying, was thinking of ourselves. I'm going to put my old executive director hat on for just a minute. As an employee, you are now an employee, but you're also responsible for employee files. So even as that, again, that one person show or the small team, it's just another example of all of the variety of things that executive directors have to deal with on a regular basis. So again, if you do have questions, we'll try and help connect you with resources and help with that. Because there are a lot of things that come by. You want to protect yourself as an employee as well. I think one thing that I was always adamant about as the executive director was making sure that we sent our financial files off to another entity, happened to be Bergan KDV, that took a look at our files twice a year just to make sure to protect me as the executive director, that there would never be any question about the integrity of our financial documents. I think that's really important to keep in mind, whether you're in a big town, a small town, or any volunteer organization that you're working with. That's really something that's important to make sure that you're protecting yourself and your organization. With that, again, Crystal, Michelle, thank you so much for this, just tons of information. I know my head's kind of spinning, so I'm sure, as I said earlier, that our other folks are too as well. So, and I want to thank everyone who tuned in today. We appreciate you being here, and want to remind you that we do have another upcoming Wednesday at 1 scheduled on December 16th, and that topic will be the Main Street Iowa Awards and kind of some processes and things that we're looking at going into next year. So thank you all for participating today. We appreciate it. Again, Crystal and Michelle, thank you so very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.